What if everything you believe about yourself is a lie? Imagine that the person you see in the mirror is just one layer, the most superficial one. Beneath that skin, behind those thoughts and far beyond your emotions, there are four distinct beings living through you. And only one of them knows you're watching this now. You were never told that ancient esoteric orders, like the forbidden wing of the Rosicrucians, map the human soul not as a single entity, but as a secret system. A system of four selves, constantly in conflict, controlled by a hidden force. This truth was buried because if you knew it, you could never be controlled again. This is your moment to awaken to the truth that was denied to you since birth. To reclaim your inner power and finally see who or what is living your life. No fluff. No fluff. Just what they never wanted you to discover. But only if you're ready. They told you that you are a person. A single being. One mind, one soul, one identity. But what if that idea, so comforting, so simple, was carefully constructed to keep you asleep? Imagine discovering that your entire life has been led by only a fraction of who you really are. That behind your thoughts, behind your emotions, and even behind your sense of self, something else has been quietly watching. Buried deep within the suppressed teachings of the Rosicrucians, those enigmatic philosophers of light and shadow, is a forbidden concept. The self is not one. It is four consciousnesses, for forces, for voices trapped inside a single vessel. One controls your body, another your feelings, a third commands your mind, and the last does not speak. It only sees, and it's the one you've forgotten the most. Most people will never hear this. The official texts, Confessio Fraternitatis, Fama Fraternitatis, don't say it openly. But between their lines, in the symbols, in the drawings of interlocking triangles and rotating squares, the truth remains encrypted. They believed that each human was a temple with four altars, and when one altar ruled over the others for too long, suffering began. Illness, confusion, the haunting sense that something's not right, even when everything looks fine. Modern neuroscience is beginning to echo this ancient whisper. Researchers like Dr. Michael Gazzaniga, through split-brain studies, have shown how the brain can host multiple centers of consciousness, each unaware of the other, yet influencing the same person. Psychologists like Richard Schwartz, creator of internal family systems, now treat the mind as a collection of distinct inner selves, all real, all living inside one skin. But none of them go as far as the Rosicrucians did. Because the Rosicrucians weren't just mapping the psyche, they were guarding the gate to something beyond it. They spoke of four kings within the self, each guarding a part of your power. The physical king, obsessed with survival. The emotional king, drowning in wounds. The mental king, addicted to control. And the silent one, the watcher, the gatekeeper. They believed that only by facing all four could someone break the illusion of individuality and step into something no doctrine dares name. But here lies the most unsettling truth. Most people are ruled by only one of the four, and they spend their entire lives thinking that's all they are. A body chasing comfort, a mind chasing validation, a heart chasing love, but the one who sees all is never heard. And it's precisely at that point that reality begins to unravel. How can a single human contain four wills? How can you tell which voice in your head is actually you? Or if any of them are at all? These are not just questions for philosophers. They're the cracks in the mask you've been wearing since the day you were born. And the moment you stop identifying with the mask is the moment something ancient begins to wake up. Something that has always been there. Waiting. Watching. Not everyone is ready to meet it. But maybe, just maybe you are. You wake up, stretch your limbs, walk to the mirror, and there it is. That face, that body, that tired expression, maybe. That sense of identity glued to skin, bones, and posture. You think, this is me. But what if that's the greatest illusion of all? What if the version of you that feels most real is actually the most primitive, the most reactive, and the easiest to manipulate? The Rosicrucians taught that the body is the outer shell of the being, not its essence. A vessel, yes, but also a distraction. They referred to it as the first mask, the guardian of the survival instinct, the altar of pain and pleasure. It's the part of you that panics when you're hungry, flinches at danger, and craves comfort above all else. But here's the real question. If this body isn't really you, why does it make so many decisions on your behalf? Modern science unknowingly supports this ancient claim. Neurologist Antonio Damasio demonstrated that much of what we consider thought actually begins in the body, in what he called somatic markers. These physical signals shape decisions before they reach consciousness. In other words, your body chooses, and then your mind invents a reason. The puppet strings are biological, but the puppeteer is not who you think. The ancient esoteric orders, not just the Rosicrucians, but also the Essenes and early Gnostics, believed that the physical self was a gate, but only those who mastered its language could pass through. They warned that if a person mistook the body for the self, they would remain trapped in cycles of hunger, exhaustion, vanity, and fear, eternally chasing comfort and calling it freedom. And they weren't wrong. Look around. Entire industries are built on keeping you identified with your body, your age, your beauty, your health, your image. You are conditioned to believe that your worth lies in how the world perceives your physical form. And when that form is threatened by illness, aging, or weakness, your very identity starts to collapse. But what if that collapse is the doorway? What if the cracks in the body's dominance are the first signs that another self wants to speak? What if the illness, the fatigue, the dissatisfaction with how you look aren't curses, but coded messages? Ancient signals from the deeper layers of your being, calling you back inward, calling you to stop worshiping the mask. Because the moment you stop obeying the body as your master is the moment you begin to hear whispers from beyond its walls. The mind resists, the ego trembles, but something else grows quiet and alert. And then right there in the silence, you begin to notice you were never the one moving. The body was moving, but you were watching. Have you ever reacted to something before you even understood why? A sudden tear, a tight chest, that sinking feeling in your stomach, and only before you try to rationalize what happened. But what if these aren't random reactions? What if an entire identity is living beneath your skin, shaping your life through silent emotional commands? A ruler hidden behind your ribcage, whispering orders that you confuse with instinct. The Rosicrucians spoke of the emotional self as the second gate. They believed it was born not from thought, but from memory, not always your own. They described it as a deep reservoir of inherited pain, unfinished stories, and ancestral imprints. To them, emotions weren't just feelings, they were echoes. Echoes of past lives, echoes of others, echoes of forgotten parts of you screaming to be heard in the present. Modern psychology is only beginning to understand this. According to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, trauma isn't just remembered, it's stored. In muscle tension, in posture, in breath, and most importantly, in emotion. These aren't just responses, they are patterns, and when left unchecked, they begin to define who you think you are. But what if they're not you at all? David Hume, centuries ago, already challenged the idea of a consistent self. We are nothing but a bundle of perceptions, he said, and emotions, he believed, were the strongest of them. Strong enough to override logic, strong enough to reshape memory, strong enough to build a false identity and convince you to defend it at all costs. What if your anger isn't yours, but your father's? What if your fear is older than your body? This is an abstract theory. It's daily reality. You say you're a sensitive person, but what if that sensitivity is an ancient wound screaming through the emotional self? You avoid confrontation, but what if it's not about kindness and more about a younger version of you hiding from something it couldn't face back then? These aren't traits. They're defenses, constructed by the emotional self to survive. But survival is not the same as living. And here's where it all begins to collapse. What happens when your emotional self starts acting against your growth? What happens when the very part of you that once protected you becomes the reason you can't move forward anymore? Because buried beneath your emotional reactions is a part of you that remembers everything you've ever felt. And it's tired of being ignored. You think all the time, Thoughts loop endlessly in the background: to-do lists, worries, memories, what-ifs, regrets. It feels like you are thinking. But what if that's not entirely true? What if the voice in your head, the one narrating your life, isn't really you but a program? A clever simulation that learned your fears, your dreams, and your limits, and now wears your name like a mask. To the Rosicrucians, this was the third self, the mental king. Not a mind in service of wisdom, but a machine obsessed with control. They believed it was the most deceptive of all the four, because it imitates consciousness so perfectly. It mimics your voice, adopts your values, and hides behind your logic. But its true nature: defense, prediction, avoidance, and above all, repetition. Modern science supports this without even realizing it. Dr. Joe Dispenza, in his studies on neuroplasticity, found that over 90% of the thoughts you have today are the same ones you had yesterday. And those thoughts create the same chemical responses in your body, which reinforce the same emotional reactions, forming a self-repeating loop. The mental self doesn't want change. It wants familiarity. And so it builds stories about who you are, about what's possible, about how the world works. Some of these stories were written in childhood, others in trauma, others inherited from people who never healed. But they become laws inside your head. I'm not good enough. Nothing ever works for me. I don't have time. And slowly, thought by thought, the cage becomes invisible. The Rosicrucians warned, beware the mind that believes it is you. Because the more you identify with the mental self, the more you become a prisoner of its loops. Philosophers like Krishnamurti echoed this, saying that true freedom begins the moment you observe thought without identifying with it. But here's the paradox. The mind doesn't want to be watched. It panics when you try. And that's when something strange happens. You begin to notice a gap, a quiet space between thoughts. And in that silence, you realize the thinker is being watched. Not by you, but by something deeper. Because when the mind is no longer in charge, a very different voice starts to emerge, not loud, not forceful, but still. And its first message is simple. You are not your thoughts. There's a part of you that doesn't flinch, doesn't react, doesn't rush to fix or judge. It's there when you're overwhelmed and there when you feel peace. It watched your childhood pass like a film. It witnessed your heartbreak without collapsing. It sees your thoughts racing and your emotions crashing, but it never interrupts. This is the subtle self, the quiet witness they never taught you to notice. The Rosicrucians called it etheris intis, the inner ether. Not a personality, not a role, but a presence. They described it not with words, but with symbols. The open eye inside a sealed triangle. To them, it was the only self that didn't want to control you because it never forgot the truth. It's not here to direct your life, only to remember who is truly living it. This isn't just mystical poetry. In the field of contemplative neuroscience, researchers like Dr. Judson Brewer and Dr. Richard Davidson have observed that during deep states of meditation, brain activity linked to self-narrative quiets down, while areas linked to meta-awareness light up. The subject reports being without story, pure observation, a sense of self that doesn't speak in words, but in presence. Ancient yogic traditions called this Sakshi Bhava, the witnessing consciousness. Zen monks called it Zazen. In both, the instruction is the same. Stop identifying, not just with the body or emotions or mind, but even with the act of doing. Because this subtle self does not do. It is. It remains. And in that stillness, clarity appears. You may have already felt it. In moments of beauty that stopped time. In grief so deep you forgot your name. In silence so complete it felt sacred. That wasn't your mind. That wasn't emotion. That wasn't ego. That was you. The part you forgot while living the life of the other three. The one that doesn't age, doesn't rush, and doesn't seek applause. But here's where things start to tremble. When this subtle self becomes more familiar than your personality, when its presence begins to outshine your reactions, that's when the illusion of identity begins to collapse, and something far older, far quieter, begins to rise in its place. Not to control, not to lead, but to remind you of a truth you've always known and always feared. They say you must become whole. That healing is about integration, that the goal is to be one with yourself. But what if that advice, so gentle, so popular, is the final trick that keeps you stuck? What if wholeness, the way it's sold today, is just a polished prison, a trap dressed as transcendence? In the oldest Rosicrucian fragments, there's a warning repeated in code. Unus fit per quatuor, but only by opposition. One becomes four, and then four become one, only through conflict, not denial. You were never meant to fuse your parts into one polite self. You were meant to face them, listen to them, let them clash. Because when you force harmony without truth, what you get is suppression, not unity. Philosopher Ken Wilber, in his critique of Boomerite spirituality, speaks directly to this illusion. He argues that many seekers chase premature transcendence, trying to be one before truly confronting their inner division. It's not integration. It's avoidance. It's dressing up the ego as enlightenment and calling it peace. But peace that requires pretending is just another form of war. And this shows up everywhere. In therapy sessions where anger is labeled as low vibration. In spiritual communities that shame sadness as a lack of gratitude. In people who force smiles while crumbling inside, chanting mantras over wounds they never dared open. This is the lie of false oneness, the attempt to silence the inner conflict rather than hear its message. Real unity, the Rosicrucians believed, only comes after each self, the physical, the emotional, the mental, the subtle, has been fully seen, named, and allowed to speak. Not merged, not conquered, but respected, because each one holds a fragment of your origin. And when they are ignored, they fight. They rebel, they possess, and they pretend to be you. But when you chase oneness too soon, something inside you starts to rot. You smile, but you're numb. You meditate, but you're hollow. And just beneath the surface, a storm begins to gather. Not because you're broken, but because three parts of you were never invited to the healing. And they're done waiting. You wake up and feel confident. By noon, doubt creeps in. Later, you're irritable for no clear reason, and by evening, you're numb. You tell yourself it's just mood swings, or maybe you're just tired. But what if that instability isn't random? What if it's the sound of four distinct forces inside you struggling to take the wheel? The Rosicrucians didn't speak of the self as a solid identity. They described it as a house with 4 rooms, each occupied by a different presence. The physical driver, the emotional guardian, the mental strategist, and the silent witness. They taught that these presences don't always agree, and when one dominates too long, imbalance arises. That war within isn't dysfunction, it's unheard intelligence. Plato hinted at this in his dialogue Phaedrus, comparing the soul to a chariot pulled by 2 horses, one noble, one wild, each dragging in opposite directions. But the Rosicrucians went further. They believed that most human suffering is caused not by external events, but by internal sabotage. A battle between voices that all think they're protecting you, but none of them are you. Modern psychology is starting to catch up. Richard Schwartz, creator of internal family systems, found that treating the mind as made of parts, not a unified ego, leads to deeper healing. Each part has its own voice, its own fear, its own mission. He discovered that when these parts are heard, truly listened to, the inner chaos begins to settle. Not by control, but by recognition. You felt this. When your body says go, but your heart says wait. When your mind wants logic, but your gut begs for meaning. It's not confusion. It's negotiation. A council meeting inside your consciousness, held every day, whether you're aware of it or not. And most of the time, one voice hijacks the rest and calls itself me. But what happens when none of them agree? What happens when the body craves pleasure, but the mind demands discipline? When the emotions plead for love, but the silent self urges detachment? That's not indecision. That's the beginning of inner awakening. Because once you hear the war clearly, you can finally ask the question no one ever taught you to ask. Who is listening to them all? Hidden in the margins of forbidden Rosicrucian scrolls, there's a symbol that appears without explanation, for circles surrounding a single point of light. It's never labeled, never decoded. But those who studied the inner workings of the self knew what it meant. Beyond the body, beyond the emotions, beyond the mind, beyond the silent witness, there is something else. A fifth presence. And this one doesn't belong to you because you belong to it. The Rosicrucians spoke of it only in whispers, calling it the unnamed, the point of origin, or the fifth light. They believed it watches the four inner selves the way you watch a dream, with detachment but not indifference. It doesn't interfere. It doesn't judge. But when all four selves collapse, when the structure of you begins to dissolve, this presence steps forward, not as a guide, but as what you have always been. This idea echoes far beyond esotericism. In Eastern traditions, it's been called Turiya, the fourth state beyond waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, yet somehow containing all three. Philosopher Sri Ramana Maharshi referred to it simply as I, the self before self-awareness. Neuroscience can't explain it. Language can't hold it. But mystics across centuries and continents have encountered it in states of complete ego dissolution. And here's what unites their accounts. The absence of identity was not terrifying. It was liberating. There was no story, no emotion, no thought. Just presence. Infinite, unshakable, silent. Some describe it as light, others as nothingness. And yet, all say the same thing. They had never felt more alive. That presence had always been there, waiting behind the mask of individuality, waiting for the noise to quiet. This is why the Rosicrucians never gave it a name, because a name would reduce it, fix it, turn it into a concept, and therefore into a limitation. They knew that to seek it directly is to push it further away. But when the four selves fall into balance, not silence, not control, but harmony, the fifth emerges, effortlessly, not as something new, but as something eternal. And it's here that the greatest fear begins to rise. Because if this fifth presence is real, then everything you've called yourself was just a performance for its gaze. And you were never the actor. You were the screen. And now the projector is flickering. You think your thoughts belong to you, that your emotions are yours to control, that your energy levels reflect your choices. But have you ever noticed how different you become depending on the hour? Calm at dawn, impulsive by afternoon, reflective at night. What if that isn't random? What if every phase of your day is a key, unlocking a different self, whether you're ready or not? According to encrypted Rosicrucian manuscripts found in 1623 near Kassel, Germany, the day is divided not by clocks, but by governors of influence. For cycles, each aligned with a different internal self. From sunrise to mid-morning, the body dominates. Hunger, motion, instinct. As noon arrives, emotion takes the lead. Mood swings, desire, sensitivity. Evening awakens the mental self, planning, judgment, overthinking. And in the silence of night, the subtle self begins to whisper. You can observe this without mysticism. Sleep science, as explored by Dr. Matthew Walker, reveals that hormonal patterns, cortisol, serotonin, melatonin, follow precise rhythms, triggering distinct shifts in attention, reaction, and perception. Meanwhile, the Ayurvedic tradition, over 2,000 years old, teaches that Vata, Pitta, and Kapha energies rotate in cycles across a 24-hour window, influencing not just the body, but mood and consciousness. And yet, most people live as if they're the same person all day long. They plan their mornings for discipline, but don't realize the body is loudest then. They expect rational focus in the afternoon, when emotions surge most. They try to make big life decisions at night, when the mental self is hyperactive, often destructive. And when the subtle self finally rises, they're asleep. This mismatch creates a silent chaos, a life out of sync not with the world, but with the shifting tides within. The Rosicrucians believed that true self-mastery begins not with domination, but with alignment, knowing when each self awakens and giving it what it needs without letting it rule. Not control, cooperation. But what happens when you start listening? When you organize your day not by deadlines, but by inner activation. When you stop fighting your nature and start honoring its rhythm. That's when the four portals open. and something begins to move through you, not chaotic, not random, but precise, ancient, and alive. You lay your head on the pillow, thinking the day is done. Thoughts slow, muscles relax, breath softens. You expect peace, rest, emptiness, but then dreams arrive. Symbols, faces, strange scenarios. Sometimes terrifying, sometimes divine. But what if they aren't dreams at all? What if every night something else inside you wakes up and begins to live a life you never remember? The Rosicrucians feared the night, not because of superstition, but because they believed that one of the four selves, the most elusive, becomes active when your conscious mind lets go. They called it the Noctis Dominus, the night ruler. According to their hidden doctrine, the emotional and mental selves go quiet during deep sleep. The body rests, and the subtle self retreats, leaving a space. And in that space, a hidden intelligence rises. Carl Jung hinted at this. He believed the dream world was not fantasy, but a confrontation with the unconscious, specifically with archetypes too powerful to meet while awake. In modern neuroscience, studies by the University of California have shown that during REM sleep, the brain revisits unprocessed trauma, creativity bursts into activity, and suppressed emotions resurface in symbolic form. This isn't rest. This is revelation. But here's the problem we forget. We wake up with fragments or nothing at all. And the most powerful messages, the ones that could unlock healing or insight, vanish like smoke. The Rosicrucians believed this was by design, that the night self protects truths too intense for daylight, that it lives in the subconscious, only surfacing when your daytime ego has surrendered, and that if you chase it directly, it disappears. Still, some remember. There are those who've practiced dream incubation, a technique found in both ancient Egyptian mystery schools and Tibetan dream yoga. These practices teach you to become aware within the dream, not to control it, but to witness the one who walks while your body sleeps. Because that presence, the night self, holds memories your waking self has buried, and it doesn't forget. And sometimes, when it does surface, you wake up changed, a sense of something lost returning, or worse, a confrontation with something you've denied for years. It's not just dreaming, it's activation, because at night, the doorway opens, and what comes through might not always be what you expect, but it was always part of you waiting for silence. You're doing everything right. You're meditating, eating well, keeping your cool. Life feels stable until, out of nowhere, you sabotage everything. You say something you didn't mean. You ghost someone you love. You spend money you don't have. And when it's over, all you can think is, what the hell just happened? But what if it wasn't a mistake? What if it was a mutiny from inside you? The Rosicrucians had a name for this. Dominatio interior, the moment when one inner self breaks its chains and seizes control. It happens silently, like a whisper that becomes a scream. The emotional self, tired of being silenced, floods you with rage or sorrow. The physical self, starved for pleasure, drives you into compulsions. The mental self spins into obsession. And the subtle self? Sometimes it just disappears. All balance collapses. Psychologists Hal Stone and Sidra Stone, creators of the voice dialogue method, discovered that people operate through primary selves, dominant parts that run the show, while disowned selves wait in the shadows. But those hidden parts don't stay quiet forever. When they feel ignored, they sabotage, they interrupt. And when they finally take control, the shift feels like you've become someone else. Because in a way, you have. One powerful case was documented by Dr. Daniel Siegel, a successful entrepreneur who would once a month disappear from work, relationships, and routines. He wasn't dissociative. He wasn't mentally ill. But under analysis, it was revealed he had an internal part formed in childhood that rejected pressure, deadlines, and expectations. That self had been buried for decades, until it couldn't take it anymore. That's what makes these rebellions so terrifying. They don't come from outside. They come from you, or rather, from the selves inside you that you've denied, dismissed, or demonized. The Rosicrucians warned that if the four cells are not acknowledged as sovereign, if they're forced into submission, one of them will rise and demand to be heard, no matter the cost. And when that moment comes, it doesn't ask permission. It shatters routines, burns bridges, destroys masks, because what it wants is not punishment, it's recognition. Not to harm you, but to make you feel what you've been ignoring. But the question that remains, and it's one no master can answer for you. When the rebellion comes, will you run from it? Or will you sit in the fire and finally listen to the voice that's been waiting in the dark? There comes a moment when the chaos becomes too loud to ignore. Your body craves one thing, your emotions pull you another way. Your mind interrupts with reasons, and your deeper self just watches it all unfold silently. You try to stay balanced, try to control it. But what if the solution isn't control at all? What if the four cells were never meant to be tamed, but aligned? The Rosicrucians believed that harmony wasn't about making all parts agree, but about finding the axis, the unseen center that each self could orbit. They called this process ordo per quatuor, order through the four. To them, each self was a force of nature, earth, water, air, and fire, each with its own rhythm, its own truth. And when they move in sync, not silence, consciousness unlocks something most people never touch: coherence. Modern science is now speaking the same language with different terms. Dr. Joe Dispenza's research into brain-heart coherence shows that when thoughts, feelings, and physical rhythms synchronize, the electromagnetic field of the body expands. In these states, people report emotional clarity, reduced anxiety, and moments of unshakable inner calm. They describe it not as peace, but as power. Stillness with voltage. But this isn't theory. It's practice. And it starts with disidentification. You are not the body, but it needs care. You are not emotion, but it speaks truth. You are not the mind, but it offers structure. And you are not just the witness, but the witness holds the key. When you stop serving one and begin listening to all, something shifts. You stop reacting. You start responding. You move with yourself, not against it. There's a story told in Eastern mystery schools of a man who tried to silence his thoughts, punish his desires, and transcend his flesh, until one day, his inner voices stopped speaking altogether. At first, he felt victorious. Then came the emptiness. And from that emptiness, he heard a voice he didn't recognize. Not thought, not emotion, not body. And yet, it spoke with complete authority. That voice didn't ask for control. It asked for allegiance from all four. And when they bowed, he stopped seeking. Because the center was no longer something to find. It had always been there. But it only rises when the war inside ends. And what it brings isn't silence. It's command. In 1917, during the renovation of a forgotten archive in Darmstadt, Germany, workers found a sealed box hidden behind a collapsed wall. Inside, aged scrolls, encrypted notes, and a diagram. 4 overlapping triangles arranged in a perfect square, with a glowing dot at the center. No text, no explanation, just a symbol, one that has appeared again and again in Rosicrucian manuscripts dating back centuries. But what was it mapping? A place? A ritual? Or something far more personal? Those who studied the hidden works of Michael Meyer and Robert Flood knew the answer. It was a map of the soul. Each triangle represented a part of the self, the physical, emotional, mental, and subtle. The center point? The potential of consciousness when the four were aligned. But this wasn't just philosophy. The Rosicrucians believed the human soul was constructed precisely as a living geometry, and that these diagrams held the instructions to reconfigure it. Robert Flood once wrote, "The microcosm is a shadow of the divine structure." He believed the human being was not only connected to the universe, but designed in the image of its laws. Geometry wasn't just mathematics. It was a spiritual technology. The diagram discovered in Darmstadt was not a symbol of ideas. It was a blueprint. A method for accessing something buried deep beneath the layers of identity, the operator behind the mechanism. This is echoed in Hermetic thought, as above, so below, and modern psychology is starting to align with it. Jung's concept of the mandala as the internal map of the psyche reflects the same principle. Mandalas are not just art. They are visual codes that reflect inner architecture. When people meditate on them, unconscious patterns surface. The same is said of the Rosicrucian diagrams. They don't teach, they trigger. And for those who dare to study them deeply, something strange begins to happen. Dreams become clearer, synchronicities increase. Internal confusion starts to feel like movement, not failure. It's as if the soul recognizes the shape, as if it's remembering something ancient, something buried, a design it was always meant to follow. But here's where the mystery grows darker. Several versions of the diagram contain symbols that no scholar has been able to decode. A fifth triangle, a circle broken at one edge, a serpent devouring itself within the center point. Were these instructions, warnings, or keys? Because some believe these aren't just maps of the soul, but activation seals waiting to be unlocked by the right state of being. And once that seal opens, the self as you know it may never be the same. There's a moment, rare and irreversible, when the walls between your inner selves begin to dissolve. The body no longer acts alone. The emotional self no longer hijacks your voice. The mind stops spinning its endless justifications. And the silent self, the watcher, opens its eyes a little wider. You don't plan for this moment. You don't chase it. But when it comes, everything you've built starts to shake. The Rosicrucians called this disgregatio the sacred fragmentation. They believe that before any awakening can occur, the four must meet each other face to face, without masks, without negotiation, just presence. But here's the part most avoid. It's not peaceful. It's not blissful. It's devastating. Because when each self sees what the others have become, they realize how long they've been living in opposition. This is why many traditions speak of ego death, dark nights of the soul, inner collapse, not as punishment, but as a necessary encounter. In those moments, the physical self often panics. The emotional self floods. The mind spins in terror. The subtle self watches. And for the first time, none of them can pretend to be you. They're all exposed. And in that rupture, a strange clarity emerges, not from effort, but from surrender. Philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard wrote about despair not as a flaw, but as a gift, the sign that the self has realized its disconnection from itself. Mystics like Meister Eckhart said, God is not found in the soul until the soul ceases to be its own. It's this inner breaking point that marks the beginning of true seeing. Not belief, not imagination, seeing. And people who've touched this space often describe the same thing. A feeling of everything collapsing inward. Their identities, roles, desires, dissolving into a stillness that's too quiet to describe. It doesn't feel like awakening. It feels like being erased, but not in a frightening way, in a way that feels inevitable. Like the self has been waiting to die, just so something real can begin to breathe. But what rises from that silence isn't what you expect. It's not a new identity, not a better version of yourself. It's something for which no language has been created, something that doesn't speak, but makes everything else silent. And it's precisely at that moment, when the four selves fall into full recognition, that the floor beneath your reality begins to fracture. Because what's underneath isn't another layer of you. It's the absence of you. There comes a silence that no music can fill. Not the silence of a quiet room, or the pause before a thought, but a silence so deep you can't tell where it begins or ends. It arrives after the body stops leading, after the emotions stop pleading, after the mind stops arguing, and even after the subtle self releases its last breath of identity. In that silence, there is no you, no name, no face, no purpose, and yet something remains. The Rosicrucians called this nulla forma, the formless center. It was the final phase in their hidden teachings, rarely discussed, never taught in public. Because once the four selves dissolve and the fifth presence steps back into stillness, what's left is not a new self, but no self at all. A consciousness unanchored, a seeing without a seer. And to the unprepared, this feels like death. But to the few who endure it, it is freedom. Mystics across traditions have echoed this experience. Ramana Maharshi described it as the moment where the questioner disappears and only the answer remains. Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah called it emptiness that sees. In Deep States of Awareness study by Johns Hopkins University during ego-dissolving psychedelic therapy, participants report something eerily similar. Not merging with the universe, but ceasing entirely and yet somehow still being. This is not what most seekers are looking for. They want peace, power, clarity. But what they often encounter at the end of the inner path is erasure. Not as punishment, but as the final truth. That the self, all of them were scaffolding, temporary forms, costumes for something far too vast to fit into a story. And when the roles fall away and no character remains to speak the lines, the stage becomes something else entirely. It's here that the greatest paradox arises. You're not lost. You're not found. You're absent and at the same time, more present than ever. It's not a feeling. It's not an insight. It's a complete stillness that sees without needing to know, without needing to be. And in that stillness, the one watching isn't you. It never was, but it has always been there. And this is where language fails, because no words can explain what it means to exist without a center. To be alive without being someone. To see not as the witness, but as seeing itself. And just before the silence consumes everything, there's a final flicker, not of identity, but of truth. A truth so vast, so quiet, so complete, that even the universe forgets to breathe. You feel clarity. You feel purpose. You hear a calm voice inside, telling you that everything is unfolding as it should. It feels like intuition, like spiritual insight. But what if it isn't? What if that voice isn't your higher self, but a very clever impersonator? What if one of your inner selves has learned the language of spirituality just to keep control? The Rosicrucians warned of this. They called it speculum falsum, the false mirror. It's when oneself, usually the mental or emotional, discovers that its control is slipping and adopts a new disguise. It begins to speak in mantras. It rationalizes suffering as karma. It calls resistance alignment. But its goal isn't truth, it's survival. It doesn't want you to wake up. It wants you to stay calm while asleep. This deception is subtle. You start avoiding conflict, thinking it's spiritual detachment. You deny your anger, calling it shadow work. You follow intuitive nudges that, somehow, always lead to comfort or escape. But if you look closely, you'll notice a pattern. Your higher self never challenges you, never breaks the ego, never brings you into raw presence. That's not your higher self. That's a mask. And this is why real transformation often begins with discomfort. The true higher presence doesn't speak in emotional comfort. It dismantles. It peels away layers of identity and safety. It doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It tells you what you've been avoiding. And when it speaks, it doesn't explain itself. It doesn't justify. It doesn't flatter. It just is. But here's the danger most never see. When oneself impersonates your higher self for too long, you begin to live in a spiritual echo chamber, looping through insight without awakening, growth without depth. Because not every calm voice is truth, and not every beautiful phrase is guidance. Sometimes it's just a frightened self wearing robes. And when you finally see through the costume, it vanishes, leaving behind a silence that cannot lie. You read the books, you take the courses, you meditate, journal, recite affirmations. Everything seems to be working for a while. But then, out of nowhere, you feel stuck again, confused, disconnected, and you start to wonder, was it all fake? Was I fooling myself? But what if the failure isn't yours? What if it's the result of walking a path with only one foot? The Rosicrucians were clear. Transformation requires alignment across all four selves: physical, emotional, mental, and subtle. Not just inspiration, not just mindset, not just healing. They believe that progress made through only one self creates instability, like building a tower on a single column. You may rise for a time, but eventually the imbalance brings collapse, not as punishment, but as correction. And yet, most spiritual paths in the modern world focus on one layer. Some aim only at the mind, reprogram your beliefs, change your thoughts. Others obsess over emotional healing, shadow work, inner child. Some retreat into the body, breath work, fasting, biohacking. And a few try to bypass all of it, seeking only the transcendent, the pure witness. But when one self is carried upward while the others are neglected, the center cannot hold. This is why you can feel so spiritually advanced and still be addicted to performance, still unable to connect deeply, still triggered by the same old wounds. The progress is real, but it's fragmented. The parts of you are not moving together. And when that happens, your own soul begins to resist. Not because it's broken, but because it refuses to ascend in pieces. The Rosicrucians offered no quick fix for this. Only structure, only rhythm. They taught that the body must be stabilized before the emotions can open, that the emotions must be heard before the mind can be rewired, and that only then does the subtle self rise without distortion. Each layer prepares the next. Skipping one invites collapse. But what happens when a fragmented self reaches for the divine? What happens when only the mind prays, while the heart bleeds in silence, when only the body fasts, while the subtle self sleeps? The path may appear straight, but it's crumbling from within. And the one walking it doesn't even know. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't being lost. It's thinking you're almost home. Freedom. It's the word that fuels almost every spiritual pursuit. Emotional liberation, mental clarity, the end of suffering. But what if freedom is impossible to reach, not because of the world, but because of the way you are built? What if each of your 4 inner selves has quietly forged its own chain, and you've mistaken them for identity? The Rosicrucians taught that every self is governed by a specific illusion. The physical self clings to comfort, routines, food, safety, stimulation. The emotional self craves validation, to be wanted, seen, rescued. The mental self demands control through logic, prediction, structure. And the subtle self, it can become addicted to transcendence, chasing silence, isolation, or oneness as a way to escape life itself. These chains are clever. They don't feel like limits. They feel like protection, but they slowly become habits, and habits become identities. You tell yourself you're just a sensitive person, or not good with change, or someone who needs space. But underneath those labels are chains, invisible, yet constantly shaping the choices you make, and the ones you never dare to consider. The most dangerous part? Each chain hides behind a virtue. The physical self says it's preserving energy. The emotional self says it's being authentic. The mind says it's being responsible. And the subtle self claims it's being spiritual. But all of them are just afraid, not of the world, but of what would happen if they let go. That's why real freedom doesn't begin with choice. It begins with recognition, with seeing each chain for what it is, not as an enemy, but as a pattern, a program. And once you see it, you don't need to fight it. You just stop obeying. That's when something cracks. Not violently, but quietly. But what happens when all 4 chains begin to loosen at once? When comfort no longer seduces you, when validation no longer defines you, when logic loses its grip, and even transcendence feels like another game. That's when you stop being a prisoner. But what you become instead, that no one can fully explain. There was supposed to be a moment, a passage, a crossing where you'd be guided, not into adulthood, but into awareness. You were meant to be shown the 4 forces within you, to learn their names, their voices, their hunger. Every ancient tradition had it, but yours was taken. And without it, you've been wandering through life with 4 rulers inside you, each one convinced it owns your name. In hidden Rosicrucian teachings, this passage was known as Quadratus Conscientia, the square of awareness. It wasn't a ritual for the elite. It was once common practice for initiates between ages 12 and 21. For trials, each one designed to introduce you to a different self. The body was tested through discipline, the emotions through loss, the mind through paradox, and the subtle self through silence. Not to conquer them, but to meet them, to know them, to stop mistaking them for you. But something happened. The modern world replaced initiation with performance. You learn how to behave, not how to see. You were rewarded for hiding emotion, punished for disobeying logic, and conditioned to ignore your body's wisdom unless it made you look better. No one ever said, "You are not a person, you are four." And so you became one, not whole, but partial. This is why the inner world feels chaotic. It's not broken, it's unintroduced. Each self is operating on instincts, unacknowledged, unexamined. And when they don't know each other, they collide. They override. They whisper opposing commands and call the confusion stress. But this isn't stress. It's an unmet soul crying out for recognition across four forgotten voices. Initiation was never meant to be ceremonial. It was meant to be disruptive. The Rosicrucians believed that only those who consciously face each self could ever become centered. Not calm, not positive, centered, where the inner world moves in rhythm, not rebellion. Where the king, the heart, the scribe, and the watcher speak around the same fire. But what if it's not too late? What if the initiation was only delayed, not denied? What if the trials you've already lived, the heartbreaks, the breakdowns, the questions, were all attempts from your soul to begin the process? And what if the part of you still searching is the part that remembers the fire that was never lit?